Every year when Passover rolls around, I'm reminded of the old question, now why did it take 40 years for the children of Israel to make that relatively brief journey from Egypt to the Promised Land? Well, my wife Gwen, who's with us here this morning, says it's really pretty simple. Even back then, Moses and the other men refused to stop and ask for directions. Or to let Miriam and the other women take the lead. I hope you noticed that in the image that I chose of a Seder plate, there's a very prominent orange on it, alongside the more traditional symbols of a shank bone and matzah, maror, the bitter herbs, the egg, the choset, which is sweetness, all symbols of the ancient story. And the orange is there because some male chauvinist rabbi supposedly said that women would never be ordained until there was an orange on a Seder plate. This spring marks 35 years since what I think of as one of the major turning points in world history during my lifetime. It was spring of 1989, when in Beijing and Tiananmen Square, unarmed students stood up against soldiers and tanks with an image of Our Lady Liberty. That autumn, it was when the Berlin Wall came down, and Lech Walesa, the leader of Poland's Solidarity movement, spoke to a joint session of the US Congress. Never mind that it was also the year of the Exxon Valdez oil spill up in Alaska and the Loma Prieta earthquake right around here. Even those events, by the way, actually got people to work together. In San Francisco, the then senior minister of First Unitarian, Victor Carpenter, was asked by the mayor to work with the head of the Jewish Community Center, Rita Semmel, who's still living amazingly at 102, and form the San Francisco Interfaith Council, housing people who were rendered homeless by the earthquake, still going strong 35 years later. I think the optimism about human rights, about interdependence without oppression, may have hit something of a high point right after '89. At Stanford, Professor Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist, actually played on a prediction by Karl Marx that history and conflict would end when oppression and exploitation ceased, and wrote a book called The End of History, saying that liberal democracy was going to prevail around the world. And yet, just this week, in the New York Times, their longtime distinguished reporter on international affairs, David Sanger, released a new book called The New Cold Wars. He starts by recalling how as late as 2002, President George Bush, in one of his numerous meetings with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, was actually discussing the possibility that the Russian Federation might join the EU, and maybe even NATO, in a meeting that took place on Putin's luxury yacht, sailing the Neva River past St. Petersburg, with a sumptuous meal served by the caterer Yevgeny Prigozhin. Later, you may recall, the head of the mercenary Wagner group, killed last year by Putin. Sanger now sees quite accurately, I'm afraid, a new polarization around the globe, with a troika of authoritarian regimes in China, Russia, and Iran, bent on countering any political or economic hegemony by the Western democracies. While those same democracies, including our own, are increasingly being undercut from within by right-wing populist movements drawn to authoritarian leaders. How did this happen? Well, I have a few of my own recollections and as a historian, a bit of an analysis. When I served as president of our denomination in the 1990s, I was often in Washington, D.C., meeting with Unitarian Universalists then serving in positions of high responsibility. Meeting, for example, with Secretary of Defense William Perry, father of our own David Perry, just as he was leaving office, so proud of having helped to reduce the danger of nuclear conflict by working with his counterparts in former Soviet nations like Kazakhstan and Ukraine to decommission and even blow up ICBM silos. Regretting, sadly, that after the failed attempt in Somalia to stop a civil war there called Black Hawk Down, he'd been unable to persuade President Clinton and the rest of the cabinet to intervene in Rwanda, where he knew that just the seizure of the radio station by a peacekeeping force might have saved 500,000 lives. A few years later, I was in the US Capitol itself with Rabbi David Saperstein, the Dean of Religious Representatives in Washington, the head of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, talking about effective religious witness for peace and justice. When we ended up in a ceremony under the rotunda celebrating the 3,000th anniversary of the founding of Jerusalem, that much contested holy place, the very name of which, of course, is City of Peace. And there I had the privilege of shaking hands with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who had courageously signed the Oslo Accords as a first step toward a two-state solution with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. But 10 days later, while he was giving a speech in Tel Aviv, Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Jewish settler from the West Bank. Not long after that, Yasser Arafat, as the head of the PLO, having signed the Oslo Agreement, refused any further crucial next steps, the Camp David Agreement. He probably legitimately feared being killed himself by his own extremists like Hamas. But he was also thinking, I'm afraid, of the corrupt fortune that he had stashed in Swiss bank accounts. My historical analysis goes all the way back to World War I. After the end of that conflict with the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations, one of the things that the idealists of the time wanted was national self-determination. It resulted in millions of people being displaced from their homes. Germans from Poland, Poles from Germany, Greeks from Turkey, Turks from Greece. The war to end all wars, the crusade for democracy, as Woodrow Wilson had called it, also imposed punitive reparations on Germany, which wise Americans like Universalist Owen D. Young warned would lead to a Second World War. In our world today, the issue before us is not just the enormous, disproportionate suffering of people in Ukraine and Gaza, the latter brought about by the heinous acts of Hamas on October the 7th, which was clearly aimed in part, by the way, at stopping any further peace efforts between Israel and the Sunni Muslim world. The possibility that the Saudis might actually recognize the existence of Israel. Well, that was too much, especially for the Iranian sponsors of Hamas, who tend to valorize in their interpretation of religion dying as a martyr, and who think that it's more important to walk and who overrun the consensus that those who think that it's more important to walk in the peaceful footsteps of the prophet that they follow. This week, nothing moved me more in the news than hearing a brief interview on NPR with a young Muslim Palestinian in Gaza, a boy of about 12, same age as my grandson, Simon Nathaniel Fernandez Buehrens, who lives not only with a long name, but with his two moms in the most ethnically, religiously, and culturally diverse and economically challenged neighborhood in Boston. What do you hope to be when you finish school? The interviewer asked the boy in Gaza. And there was a moment of silence before he said, "Maybe I'll be a martyr." And his mother in the background jumped in and said, "You should be a doctor." And sounded like a good Jewish mother. Yet as Black UU theologian Bill Jones once put it, and Richard, I've got to get you his book called Is God a White Racist? Bill would often say, diagnosis dictates therapy. How we diagnose a given social problem determines what solutions we bring to bear. I mentioned earlier that the whole of the Passover story, can be used either to preserve a memory of unmerited suffering, or it can be used to deepen empathy, to deepen the resolve that others should be freed from oppression. There are, of course, contested interpretations of every religious tradition we know. Those who interpret it narrowly, nationalistically, ethnocentrically, and those who interpret religion as it should be, more empathically, more universally, as though the core values can be taken into a global dialogue. For a while, I had the further experience of being the honorary president of Religions for Peace, the world conference that the first president of the UUA formed with a Buddhist leader in the 1970s to try to counter the global arms race. That organization at one point actually negotiated how the religious leaders of Jerusalem would treat one another and provide access to all of the holy places if the politicians would do their job and get out of the way and allow the faith leaders to lead their people in being faithful. Well, we've seen even here in America how our own democracy, our House of Representatives, can be brought to a crushing halt by people who interpret the national self-interest and Christianity in the most narrow and demagogic ways. But then how do we respond? I say we keep our eyes on the prize. The possibility of a sense of human rights and interdependence without oppression need never be lost as long as we stay faithful. We need to remember how many allies we have in many different traditions, and how a whole secular human rights movement across the globe is gaining adherence slow step by slow step. There's a reading in the back of our hymnals. Well, it's actually a setting of a short hymn. Since what we choose is what we are, and what we love we yet shall be, the goal may ever shine afar. The will to win it sets us free. I think of that in relation to the scriptural line, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. 50 years from now, I hope we will have reason to feel vindicated that our work for human rights was not in vain. Believe it or not, we can rally people of all faiths to the cause. Earlier, we heard a Jewish prayer for peace, one I know is being repeated at many Seder tables in Israel itself and here in America and in Europe. It's in the back of our hymnal too, along with a Muslim prayer. Save us, most merciful God, from our folly by your wisdom, from our arrogance by your forgiving love, and from our greed by your bounty, and from our insecurity by your healing power. And then there is this one from a liberal Christian source. Save us from weak resignation to violence. Teach us that restraint is the highest expression of power, that thoughtfulness and tenderness are the mark of the strong. Help us to love our enemies, not by countenancing their sins, but by remembering our own. This Passover, let us pray for the peace of Jerusalem indeed.